The night she asked her husband for a divorce, he didn't argue. He simply reached into his coat, placed an old brass key on the table and said, "Before you leave, there's something I need you to see." She had no idea that key opened the one place he had spent months rebuilding in secret. Because sometimes the person who seems to be giving up on your marriage is actually the person fighting hardest to save it. For 8 years, Daniel and Claire had built what looked like a perfect life. They had a comfortable home outside Nashville, good jobs, a goofy golden retriever named Charlie, and a kitchen filled with memories from the early years of their marriage. But lately, Claire had started feeling like she was married to a stranger. Daniel came home late. He answered emails during dinner. He stopped suggesting weekend trips. And whenever Claire asked what was wrong, he gave her the same tired smile. "Nothing. I'm just working through some things." That answer only made things worse. One Friday evening, Claire came home to find Daniel sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at a small envelope. She watched him slip it into his jacket when he noticed her. "What was that?" she asked. "Nothing." Claire laughed bitterly. "That word seems to be your favorite lately." Daniel looked at her, but said nothing. For months, Claire had tried to convince herself that marriage simply went through difficult seasons. But that night, something inside her finally broke. She looked across the table at the man she had once believed would tell her everything. "I think we should get divorced." Daniel didn't move. He didn't plead. He didn't even look angry. Instead, he slowly reached into his jacket and placed something on the table between them, an old brass key. Claire stared at it. "What is that?" Daniel looked toward the hallway. "It belongs to the house where we first met." Claire's expression changed instantly, because that house had been gone for years, or at least that was what she believed. And Daniel had never told her that he'd been going back there every weekend for the last 6 months. Claire picked up the brass key but didn't understand. "The house was demolished," she said. "I saw the news." Daniel nodded. The original house was. He reached across the table and gently took the key back. But the property wasn't. Claire stared at him. For the first time in months, Daniel looked almost nervous. He told her that 6 months earlier, he discovered the old property was being sold. The small farmhouse where they'd met had been abandoned for years, but the original structure was still standing behind a collapsed shed. He had bought the property quietly. Claire couldn't believe it. "You bought our old house?" "Not exactly." "Then what did you buy?" Daniel hesitated. "The chance to give you something back." That answer frustrated her more than it comforted her. She accused him of hiding money, hiding plans, and possibly hiding another life from her. Daniel didn't defend himself. Instead, he asked her to wait until morning. Claire refused. "If you really want me to understand, take me there now." So just before midnight, they drove through the quiet Tennessee roads. When they finally turned onto the old dirt lane, Claire recognized the trees before she recognized anything else. The oak tree where Daniel had once carved their initials was still there. The old stone fence was still standing. And behind it, beneath a new roof and freshly painted walls, was a house. Their house. Claire stepped out of the car without saying a word. Daniel followed. Inside, everything looked different, but somehow familiar. The fireplace had been restored. The wooden floors had been repaired. And on one wall hung dozens of photographs from their marriage. Their first Christmas, their courthouse wedding, their honeymoon, Charlie as a puppy, Claire laughing with flour on her face. But then she noticed something strange. There were no recent photographs, nothing from the last 2 years. She turned toward Daniel. "Why?" He lowered his eyes. "Because those were the years I couldn't figure out how to get back to you." Claire's anger began to crack. Then Daniel opened a small door at the end of the hallway. Behind it was a room she had never seen before, and inside was something that made her completely forget about the divorce. A dining table, set for 2, exactly like the tiny restaurant where they had their first date. But there was one more thing sitting in the center of the table. A handwritten note with Claire's name on it, and she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was her own. Claire stared at the handwriting. She hadn't seen that letter in years. Daniel had found it tucked inside an old cookbook while restoring the farmhouse. It was something Claire had written when they were 24, just months after their first date. She had forgotten all about it. Daniel handed it to her. Claire unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The letter wasn't romantic in the way she remembered romance. It was simple. She had written about the kind of life she wanted someday. A small house, a warm kitchen, a table where they could sit together without phones, a place where they could grow old without becoming strangers. And at the bottom, she had written one sentence. If I ever start chasing everything except us, please remind me why we started. Claire's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Daniel. You kept this for 17 years. Why didn't you show me? Daniel gave a tired smile. Because I thought I could fix everything first. That was when Claire finally understood the distance between them. Daniel hadn't been avoiding their marriage, he had been desperately trying to repair it. His long nights weren't about another woman, his secret phone calls weren't about leaving. He had been working extra hours because the farmhouse had cost more than he expected. He had sold his old truck. He had canceled a planned vacation. And every weekend, while Claire believed he was pulling away, he had been restoring the place where their marriage had begun. But Claire wasn't ready to forgive him yet. She asked a question that had been hurting her for months. Then why didn't you just tell me? Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Because every time I tried to talk to you, you were already talking about everything we had lost. Claire looked away. He continued quietly. I thought if I could give you one place where we could remember what we hadn't lost yet, maybe you'd want to stay. Claire wiped her eyes. Then she noticed another envelope sitting beneath the letter. This one was newer. Her name was written across the front. She opened it. Inside was a single page. Daniel had written it only 3 days earlier, and the first sentence made her heart stop. If you're reading this, I probably failed. Claire looked up at him. What does that mean? Daniel didn't answer. He simply walked toward the front door. Then he said something that made her realize the night wasn't about saving their marriage anymore. It was about giving her a choice. Claire followed Daniel onto the porch. The night was quiet, except for the wind moving through the trees. She held his letter against her chest. You said you probably failed, she whispered. Failed at what? Daniel looked at the house behind them. At making you happy. Claire shook her head. You don't get to decide that for me. I know. Then why are you giving me this place? Daniel took a slow breath. Because you once told me this was the life you wanted. And somewhere along the way, I became so focused on giving you everything that I forgot to ask whether you still wanted it. Claire had no answer. For years, they had both been trying to protect their marriage in completely different ways. She had wanted Daniel's time. He had wanted to give her security. She had interpreted his sacrifice as distance. He had interpreted her frustration as disappointment in him. And neither had stopped long enough to ask the simplest question. What do you actually need from me? Daniel handed her the brass key. The house is yours. Claire stared at him. What? I put everything in your name. Her eyes widened. You're leaving? Daniel nodded slowly. If you want the divorce, I'll sign whatever you put in front of me. Claire's eyes filled again. But if you don't, he paused, then I'll stay. Not because I spent 6 months rebuilding this place, not because I bought it for you. I'll stay because I want to start over with you, and this time I'll actually listen. Claire looked down at the key. For months, she'd imagined the moment she finally walked away. She thought she'd feel relief. Instead, she felt something she hadn't expected. She remembered the 24-year-old Daniel who had spilled coffee on their first date. The man who had waited outside her apartment for 3 hours during a thunderstorm because she'd forgotten her keys. The husband who still knew exactly how she liked her coffee. And suddenly, all those little memories felt more important than the arguments she'd been keeping score of. She stepped closer. You really thought I wanted a house? Daniel smiled sadly. No. Then what did you think I wanted? He looked directly into her eyes. You. Claire began to cry. Then, for the first time in months, she laughed through the tears. "You are unbelievably bad at communicating." Daniel laughed too. "I've been told." She held up the key. "Then we're going to have a lot to talk about." Daniel nodded. But Claire wasn't finished. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "I canceled the divorce appointment." Daniel froze. "When?" "Yesterday." For the first time that night, he looked completely stunned. Claire smiled. "I just needed to know whether you still wanted me." Daniel stepped toward her. "I never stopped." And then Claire noticed something through the window. The dining table inside wasn't actually set for two. There was a third place setting. And on that plate was a small birthday cake. Tomorrow was her birthday. Daniel had remembered. She hadn't. Claire stood in the doorway, staring at the little cake. Written across the frosting were 6 simple words. "For the woman I never stopped choosing." She laughed through her tears. "You really made a cake?" Daniel nodded. "I tried." Claire looked at the uneven frosting. "You definitely tried." They both laughed. And for the first time in months, the silence between them didn't feel empty. It felt comfortable. They sat at the old dining table until nearly 3 in the morning, talking about everything they had avoided for years. Claire admitted she had confused Daniel's silence with indifference. Daniel admitted he had confused providing for her with loving her properly. Neither of them blamed the other. They simply listened. A week later, Claire moved a few boxes into the farmhouse. Not because everything was magically fixed. It wasn't. They still had difficult conversations ahead. They still needed to rebuild trust. But this time, they were rebuilding it together. Over the following months, the farmhouse became more than a renovation project. It became their new beginning. Claire planted flowers beside the porch. Daniel rebuilt the old kitchen table. Charlie spent most afternoons sleeping beneath the oak tree where their initials were still carved into the bark. And every Friday night, they ate dinner without their phones. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they argued. Sometimes they laughed until one of them couldn't breathe. But they stayed. One evening, almost a year after the night Claire had asked for a divorce, she found Daniel standing beneath the old oak tree. He was holding the brass key. She walked toward him. "What's that for?" Daniel smiled. "I thought we could give it to someone else." Claire looked confused. Then she noticed a young couple standing beside the farmhouse. They were newly married friends who had been struggling to find their own place. Daniel handed them the key. "This house gave us a second chance," he said. "Maybe it can give you one too." Claire looked at her husband. Daniel reached for her hand, and she realized something she'd spent almost a year learning. A marriage doesn't fall apart because two people stop loving each other. Sometimes they simply stop telling each other how they need to be loved. The house hadn't saved their marriage. The key hadn't saved it. Daniel hadn't saved it. They had. Because when love gives you one more chance to listen, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay.